Don't waste your time on street kids. You can barely feed yourself. The boss's vicious words still rang in Walter Green's ears as he shuffled down the familiar path. In his late 52, Walter was a weary black man who walked with a heavy limp, a permanent reminder of his long years of toil at the factory. The boss always used the limp as an excuse to call him slow, useless, a man lucky to still have a job at all. But Walter never talked back. He swallowed the insults, the same way he bore the chronic ache in his bones, and simply lowered his head and carried on. A few days prior, while passing a darkened alleyway, a flicker of movement in the shadows had made him pause. Squinting, his old heart clenched at what he saw. "Dear God," he'd whispered. There were two children, a boy and a girl, their skin pale from the cold, so thin their cheekbones stood out in sharp relief. They were huddled together in threadbare clothes, seeking what little warmth they could from each other. Their eyes, wide and feral like two cornered animals, stared up at him in fear. Just then, a gravelly voice, dripping with contempt, called out from behind him. "Look what old man Walter's dragged out of the trash." Walter froze. Mr. Harlan, his boss, approached, his breath reeking of liquor. He sneered, looking down at the children with disgust. "Don't waste your time on these strays, Walter," he scoffed. "You can barely feed yourself." With that, he spat on the snow-dusted ground and turned away, his laughter swallowed by the wind. Harlan's words were like needles, piercing Walter's pride, but instead of driving him off, they became a goad. He took a deep breath, the freezing air stinging his lungs. He turned back and slowly knelt on one knee before the children, careful not to frighten them. "Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice low and gentle. "My name's Walter." The older boy held his sister tighter, his eyes wary. Walter offered a kind smile, one that softened the weary lines etched on his face. "It's too cold out here, little ones. I've got a warm place." "Some hot soup too," he said, his voice earnest. "Just for tonight, so you don't freeze, okay?" The little girl looked hesitantly at her brother. The boy stared deep into Walter's eyes that were tired, but held no trace of malice. After a long moment of silence, he gave a slight nod. Walter let out a quiet sigh of relief. He rose to his feet and held out both his hands. "Come on, children, let's go home." Two small, pale, ice-cold hands timidly found their way into his own large, calloused and warm ones. Walter's walk home felt longer than usual, not only because his aching leg protested the biting cold, but because he was now guiding two small lives. They said nothing, walking silently behind him, their trust placed completely in the stranger who had just pulled them from the alley. His apartment building was old and run down, the wooden stairs groaning with every footstep. Walter had to lean on the railing, stifling a groan of his own as he made his way up to the second floor. The old key scraped in the lock, and then the door swung open. Instantly, a wave of warmth rushed out, wrapping around them like an invisible blanket. Grace let out a soft gasp, a blush rising on her cheeks. Eli just stared around, wide-eyed. The apartment was a single, simple room, cramped with a worn-out armchair, an iron bedstead, and a small kitchenette in the corner. There was nothing fancy about it, but it was clean, tidy, and above all, it was warm. The faint smell of old wood and coffee hung in the air. Walter didn't say much. He gently gestured for them to sit in the lone armchair they huddled together, taking up less than half the space while he went to the kitchen. He pulled out a can of tomato soup, what he'd been saving for his own dinner, and emptied it into a small pot on the stove. The hiss of the gas flame filled the silence, soon followed by the gentle bubbling of the soup. The children's eyes were fixed on the pot, their stomachs beginning to rumble with a hunger they could no longer suppress. Walter ladled the soup into two chipped bowls, placed them carefully on a small tray, and brought it to them. "Careful, it's hot," was all he said. Eli ate ravenously, oblivious to the heat scalding his tongue. He was so hungry he could feel nothing but the glorious taste of hot food. Grace was more methodical, blowing on each spoonful with care, but her eyes never left the bowl until the last drop was gone. Walter didn't eat. He just sat on the edge of his bed, watching them in silence, a strange warmth spreading through his own chest, more comforting than the heat from the radiator. When the two bowls were empty, Walter collected them. He went to his bed and pulled off his only thick blanket, along with a patched-up old quilt. He spread them on the floor next to the old radiator that was giving off a steady heat, creating a small, cozy nest. He looked at the two children, their eyes already heavy with food and warmth. "Go on," he patted the makeshift bed. "Get some sleep, little ones. You're safe here." They hesitated for a moment before crawling under the covers. Walter tucked them in, pulling the blanket right up to their chins. The warmth from the blankets and the radiator quickly lulled them to sleep. The presence of Eli and Grace had lit a warm flame in the small apartment, but it also stretched Walter's meager existence thinner than ever. Food now had to be split 3 ways. The heating bill crept up, and every penny he earned had to be carefully accounted for. The one place with no warmth was the steel mill. The searing heat from the furnaces and the deafening noise only made Walter's bad leg ache more. And there was always Mr. Harlan. "Move it, Walter," the boss shrieked over the deafening machinery. "You're moving like a dying turtle." Walter just lowered his head, trying to pick up the pace. But Harlan always seemed to find an excuse to humiliate him, especially since he'd learned Walter had taken in the two children. One afternoon, as Walter was struggling to haul a heavy steel beam, Harlan walked over, crossing his arms with a mocking grin. "Christ, Walter, those orphans you picked up could probably haul faster than you," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "At least they have an excuse to be hungry." The other workers heard. A few of them snickered. The words felt like a knife in Walter's chest. He clenched his jaw, a hot flush of shame creeping up his neck, but he said nothing. He just thought of the 2 small faces waiting for him at home, and that was the only thing that allowed him to swallow the bitterness. Every evening, when the apartment door closed behind him, Walter seemed to shrug off the heavy world outside. Grace's clear laughter, or Eli's curious questions, were a balm for all his wounds. Their dinners were often just a simple stew, but Walter always ladled the biggest pieces of meat and potato into the children's bowls. His own portion was often little more than thin broth and a few vegetable scraps. "Aren't you hungry, Mr. Walter?" Eli had once asked, looking at his nearly empty bowl. Walter just smiled, a warm expression that chased away all his fatigue. "I ate at the mill, son, just having a little to warm myself up." It was a lie, but one that came easily to him. On cold nights, after the children were sound asleep in their warm nest on the floor, Walter would sit by the dim lamp. With his large, rough hands, calloused from labor, he would carefully stitch a tear in Eli's only jacket. His clumsy fingers were sometimes pricked by the needle, but he would just quietly suck the drop of blood away and carry on, his focus absolute on each and every stitch. He'd noticed Grace's shoes were worn through, the soles thin and the toes split open. She never complained, but Walter saw how she'd curl her toes when she walked on the cold floor. And so, an old glass jar was placed discreetly on top of the cabinet. Every day after getting paid, Walter would set aside a few loose coins, the little that was left after buying food, and carefully drop them into the jar. The clink of the coins hitting the glass was a secret melody of hope, a silent promise that Grace's little feet would soon be warm. The love inside Walter's small apartment was a world of its own, but the moment he stepped into the hallway, the real world came rushing back, cold and cruel. News of the old black man raising 2 white children spread through the apartment building like a smoldering fire. It didn't erupt into open confrontation, but crept through whispers, sideways glances, and doors that were quickly shut as he passed. One morning, just as Walter was locking his door to leave for the mill, he overheard Mrs. Gable, the nosy neighbor from down the hall, speaking to someone else. Her voice was intentionally lowered, but still loud enough for him to hear. "I just can't believe it. An old black man like him, saddling himself with two little white mouths to feed. He can barely look after himself." Another voice, even more bitter, replied, "Mark my words, the second those kids are old enough, they'll take whatever he has and be gone. All that kindness for nothing. The old fool." Walter froze for a second, his hand tightening on the handle of his lunch pail. The words were like shards of broken glass, digging into his skin, but he wouldn't let himself bleed. He didn't turn around, didn't argue. He just took a deep breath, pushing down the sharp ache in his chest, and kept walking, his back seeming to stoop just a little lower. 15 years passed. Under Walter's care, the two scrawny children had grown into bright, studious young adults. The turning point came one evening, when Eli held up a letter, his voice a mix of excitement and anxiety. "Mr. Walter, we got full scholarships to a big university in the city." Grace sat beside him, her eyes glistening with tears. "But we'd have to go so far away. We don't want to leave you." Walter looked at the two faces he had loved for so many years. He smiled, a gentle smile tinged with sadness. He placed his hands on their shoulders, his voice firm. "This is your chance. The door to the world is opening for you. You have to walk through it." On the day they left, Walter took them both to the train station. He pressed a worn leather wallet into Eli's hand. Inside it, all the money he had managed to save. "It's not much," he said, "but it'll get you started." They threw their arms around him, holding him tight. "Thank you for everything," Eli whispered. "Just live a good life," was all Walter said. He stood on the platform, watching the train disappear down the tracks, carrying his reason for living away with it. When he returned, the apartment door opened to a silence that was overwhelming. No more laughter, no more sounds of studying. Loneliness washed over him, heavy and cold, but woven into it was a quiet, simmering pride. He had given them a future, and for Walter, that sacrifice was its own reward. After the train departed, Walter's life fell back into the rhythm he had once known, but it was now missing a vital heartbeat. The silence in the apartment was no longer peaceful, it was a void. He still went to the mill, still came home each night, but there was no one waiting for him at the door anymore. The worn-out armchair now held only him. The years passed in silence, etching deeper lines onto Walter's already weary body. His back grew more stooped, his limp more pronounced, and the ache in his leg was no longer a dull throb, but a constant, gnawing pain. Sometimes, after a long day's work, his hands would tremble so badly he could barely hold his soup bowl steady. He told himself it was just old age. Then came the dry cough. It started as a simple tickle in his throat, but it grew persistent, escalating into racking fits that seized his chest and jolted him awake in the middle of the night. His strength began to fail him rapidly. He lost weight, and even the neighbors, who still kept their distance, started to notice the pale, gaunt look on his face. Finally, after a coughing spell left him dizzy and nearly made him collapse on the factory floor, Walter relented and went to the small-town clinic. The old doctor, after reviewing the results, looked at him with sympathetic eyes. His words were gentle, but they fell upon Walter like a death sentence. It was a severe lung disease, the result of decades breathing in metal dust at the mill. "We need to start treatment immediately, Walter," the doctor said. "It will require specialists and specific medications." Walter just listened in silence, his mind a blank. Then he asked a single question, his voice raspy. "How much will it cost?" The number the doctor gave him was staggering. It was a colossal sum, a fortune he could never hope to earn in a lifetime of labor. He thanked the doctor mechanically and shuffled out, the diagnosis crumpled in his hand. When the apartment door closed behind him, Walter sank into the armchair. The four silent walls seemed to press in on him. The disease wasn't just a threat to his life, It was an insurmountable mountain of debt, and he knew he had to face it alone. In the dead of night, a violent coughing fit seized him. Walter gripped the side of his bed, his chest screaming in pain. As the fit subsided, he gasped for air, his eyes falling on the old telephone on his nightstand. Just one call, that's all it would take. He knew. Walter's trembling hand opened the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a yellowed slip of paper. On it was an address and a phone number, written in Grace's careful script from her last letter. It was an escape, a salvation. His hand reached out, his bony fingers nearly brushing the receiver, but then he stopped. No, the thought blazed through his mind. If he called now, it would all become a transaction. The bowls of soup he'd given up, the jacket he'd mended, the money he'd saved for shoes. All of it would be turned into an investment he was now calling in. He would become their burden. His kindness wasn't a debt for them to repay. It was a gift. With a single, resolute motion, Walter slid the slip of paper back into the drawer and shut it. The dry click echoed in the silent room. He had chosen to protect their pure memory of him over saving himself. Walter began to sell off what few possessions he had left. First went the old radio, then his small collection of books. Each item sold bought him a few painkillers, a few cans of thin soup to get him through the day. His body withered, his clothes hung loosely on his frame, and the cough became a familiar, painful soundtrack to the silence of the apartment. One afternoon, when the pain in his chest became unbearable, Walter managed to drag himself to the clinic. He was only hoping for a stronger dose of painkillers. Working the front desk was Anna, a young nurse who had grown up in the neighborhood. She remembered Walter vividly. As a little girl, she'd always see him on his way home from work, a quiet black man with a heavy limp, but whose eyes always held a gentle kindness. He was one of the few adults who would always smile and give her a proper nod, hello. Seeing Walter now, Anna almost didn't recognize him. His face was gaunt, his skin ashen, and the once broad shoulders were now slumped and shrunken from the illness and the ceaseless coughing. Her heart ached for him. "Mr. Walter," she called out softly. "Are you all right?" Walter looked up, managing a weak smile. "Just an old man's cough, dear. Came to see if I could get some more of that pain medicine." While he waited for the doctor, Anna secretly pulled up his medical file. The cold, clinical words on the page were even more frightening than his appearance. Terminal lung cancer. Prognosis poor. Patient has refused specialized treatment. She understood it all in an instant. He hadn't refused. He couldn't afford it. And she knew for a fact that a man as proud as him would never ask for help. That evening, after her shift, Anna sat alone in the quiet office. The image of the frail, lonely Walter haunted her. She remembered the old neighborhood whispers about the two white children he had taken in, Eli and Grace. They were the only hope. She opened Walter's file again. Under the emergency contact section, there was a faded name and number, Eli Green. Years had passed, but she decided to take the chance. Her palm was slick with sweat as she dialed each number. After a few rings, a deep, confident male voice answered. "Hello, I'm sorry to bother you," Anna said, her own voice trembling slightly. Am I speaking with Eli, who used to live with Mr. Walter Green?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Yes, this is Eli. Is something wrong with Walter?" His voice instantly sharpened with tension. Anna took a deep breath. "I'm a nurse at the town clinic. You need to come home. Now, Mr. Walter. He's very, very sick. And he was never going to tell you." Anna's words were a lightning strike. Eli barely managed a thank you before hanging up, his hand shaking not from fear, but from a cold, rising fury and a wave of grief. He called Grace immediately. There was no need for a long explanation. Only one sentence. "Walter's sick. We have to go back." Less than 24 hours later, a sleek, luxury car glided down the town's familiar, worn-out streets, pulling up in front of the run-down apartment building where they had grown up. The car doors opened. Eli, now a successful architect in a tailored suit, and Grace, a respected journalist with an air of confidence, stepped out. They were no longer the orphans from the alley. They walked up the groaning wooden stairs, the sound painfully familiar. Eli knocked gently on the apartment door. A long moment passed before it creaked open. Walter stood there, a shadow of his former self. He was gaunt, racked by a dry cough, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. Seeing them, he was stunned. The shock quickly gave way to confusion and a flicker of shame. "Children, what are you doing here?" he stammered, trying to straighten his posture. "You should be at your jobs." Grace said nothing. She rushed forward and threw her arms around him, burying her face in the bony shoulder of her adoptive father and breaking into sobs. "We're so sorry," she wept. "We should have been here." Her embrace and her tears shattered every wall of pride Walter had tried to build. Eli stepped inside, his voice no longer holding the uncertainty of a child, but the firm resolve of a man. "You're not staying here another minute." Their actions were swift and decisive. That very afternoon, a private ambulance arrived. Eli had already called the best hospital in the city. On the phone, his voice had been steel. "I don't care what it costs. Get him the top specialists. I want him transferred. Immediately." But they didn't just pay for his treatment. While Walter was being cared for by a first-class medical team, Eli and Grace set a larger plan in motion. They refused to let Walter's kindness remain a private story. The world had to know. Grace, using her credentials as a journalist, contacted her colleagues. She didn't pitch a sob story about a sick old man, but an epic of unconditional kindness. She wrote, "This is not a story about a black man who took in 2 white children. This is the story of a human being who planted a seed of compassion in the most barren of soils, and that seed grew." Meanwhile, Eli used his social connections to establish the Walter Green Foundation for Unconditional Kindness. The foundation's goal wasn't just to cover Walter's expenses, but to help others in the community who were struggling. News of Eli and Grace's return swept through the town faster than a storm. It began with whispers. Mrs. Gable, the nosy neighbor, had been glued to her window when the private ambulance and the luxury car had pulled up. She had seen it all. The 2 successful, well-dressed young adults escorting a frail, ashen Walter Green from the building. First came the curiosity, then the astonishment. "It's those 2 orphans from all those years ago," people whispered to each other. "They came back for old man Walter." The astonishment quickly turned into a collective shock when Walter's story hit the front page of the local paper, and then the regional news channels. His weary, kind face appeared on TV screens in diners and living rooms. They didn't just hear about his illness. They heard the full story of the quiet sacrifices, the surrendered meals, the mended jacket, the saved for shoes. For the town, it was like a mirror had been held up to its own face, and the reflection was ugly. Mrs. Gable sat in her kitchen, the newspaper spread out on the table. The headline, "The Steelworkers' Seed of Kindness," seemed to burn her eyes. She remembered her own bitter words to her neighbor as if it were yesterday. "Mark my words, they'll take whatever he has and be gone." The old fool. A hot, searing shame crept up her face. She had been wrong, so terribly wrong. The old fool she had mocked was, in fact, the wisest, richest man among them all. At the steel mill, the silence was unnatural. The workers who had once snickered at Harlan's insults now avoided each other's gaze. Walter's story had become a silent judgment on their own cowardice. Harlan, upon seeing the article, had crumpled it up and thrown it in the trash with a curse, but he couldn't throw away the looks from the men around him. His power was built on fear and contempt, but now the man he'd held in the most contempt had become a symbol of honor, making him seem small and pathetic. The change wasn't just guilt, It turned into action. The Walter Green Foundation received a flood of small donations from the townspeople themselves, a few anonymous dollars mailed by Mrs. Gable, a day's wages from a fellow steelworker, a waitress's tips. It wasn't just money, it was penance. It was an admission. The same people who had once avoided Walter on the street now told his story to their children and grandchildren as a local legend. They no longer saw a limping black man, an oddity. They saw a quiet giant. They had failed to see the hero living among them, and now, as the outside world celebrated him, they finally bowed their heads in belated admiration. Months later, Walter was no longer in a sterile hospital room, but in a sun-drenched room overlooking a quiet garden. It was his new home, Eli and Grace's home. The cough was nearly gone, and though the limp remained, his steps were lighter than they had ever been. He no longer heard the roar of the mill or the venomous whispers in the hallway. Instead, there was Grace's laughter and the low, warm timbre of Eli's voice. One afternoon, he sat in a plush armchair, watching the two children he had rescued from that frozen alley. Now, they were the ones caring for him, not out of obligation, but with a deep, pure love. He looked out the window, where his new neighbors smiled and waved at him. He was no longer an outcast. He was a living legend. Walter realized then that they hadn't just saved him from a disease. They had saved him from the judgment and loneliness that had shadowed his entire life. His kindness had never been a pointless sacrifice. Walter had saved two children from the cold, and years later, they had saved him from loneliness and death. Their story affirmed that kindness is not an investment seeking a return, but a seed of faith planted in the world. And when that seed is given unconditionally, it multiplies and comes back, not just to save one life, but to awaken an entire community.